Ladies and gentlemen, we're back, whether you like it or not. It's Wednesday, DebateSensei. I'm Jared Kabika-Miller. We got Matt Shapiro, Esquire.
Hello.
Yo. We got Tim Seavey from Bizolutions, San Diego State University.
Back in the house.
Yes. We said you went Kerouac last week.
I sure damn did.
Yeah. It sounded rough.
Under a bridge somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, man. You should read On the Road. It's a great book. Great book. Anyways, we are here talking about plan specification. It's, you know what?
Exciting.
I'll admit, it's not the sexiest topic right on top, okay? But the honest to goodness reason why I want to do this is because I think that it yields so many possibilities, like in such a compact little space, you know what I mean? And so there's a whole bunch of different specification ones that we could go through, and not only that, but they set up strategies really well, especially on the negative.
Yeah.
So that's my overview. That's my overview. All right. But let's take a look at spec. So whenever so there's all these acronyms and the abbreviations. Everyone calls these spec arguments or specification. All right. So devil's in the details is the way I like to think about it.
Yeah. Typically, you'll give like a plan text, right? You're like, this is my plan. Maybe you have a tagline. And then you deliver the plan text, which will be we're going to, save a bunch of whales, say. And then now you have to go through these specifications of your plan to be complete in a policy style round. Jared, I asked you a little bit before. Let's start off, let's start with Jared, Tim, you too. What are some or the plan specifications you are most familiar with, and maybe some we're not so familiar with? So Jared, first.
Well, okay, let's usually, I guess maybe it's just because it is, alphabetical, but the first one I always remember is a spec, and so that's how people just refer to it, a spec. Now that means agent specification. So the agent specification is, I guess there's a couple reasons why you do that, right? It's like, one, you want to make sure that the agent actually has jurisdiction. Yeah, you know what I mean? And so, like if you say, I don't know, the United States will go and arrest this person in a foreign country and try them for war crimes. I'm like, well, I don't know if the United States is the body to do that. You know what I mean? I think there would be an international agency. And so that would be one reason to do it. But the other reason to do agent specification is because you could run a alternate agent counterplan.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Set that up. Go for it, Tim.
I see a lot of good ones come in when it's a discussion of federal or states' rights. So like oftentimes it'll be like USFG will do whatever. And sometimes, say it's like related to voting, like, well, that's technically like the states are the ones that are supposed to be enforcing this, or even if it's not supposed to, maybe the states are actually better actors, like they are a better entity to carry some particular policy out. And so that's where like you can, as a negative team, just have the strategy being like, that little detail right there, like, okay, fine, you're doing your plan, you're saving the whales, whatever. But like if this different body were to do it, it would be so much better. And there's all these reasons why. So that's where an agent spec would go along with a counter plan that has, a difference. So
even just an alternate branch of the federal government. Like I remember planning out like running executive order counter plans to laws. You know what I mean? Like, and it'd be some generic arguments about how much faster it could be, or that it would be maybe based on an inherency argument, like the root cause of this isn't a law, it is it's an executive order. So
it really comes into play too if the resolution itself were to say if for instance, let's say the United States federal government will pass will legislate to save the whales, if that's the word, and then legislate is a term of art, right? So you can't have, for instance, the president legislate anything. They can try to convince legislators or members of Congress to pass something, but the president himself or herself would not have the power to do any pass legislation on their own. So what this comes down to is really fundamentally at the most basic level, a research question. So you need to know going into the round on the affirmative, one good part about plan specifications, agent being number one we're talking about, is you need to kind of use plan specifications as a means to understand your plan, because you need to know these things to go in the round. And on the neg, what Jared was talking about, not totally encompassing what Jared was talking about, but when I get up on the AF and the resolution says the U.S. government should legislate for saving the whales, and I say the president should pass an executive order, unknowing that the term of art means it needs Congress, Jared on the neg, if he's savvy enough, will stand up and say, the plan will fail. You should not vote for that plan because the president who has executive power can't legislate, period. So their plan cannot work. Like that is that removes any sort of solvency, removes sort of any sort of power, jurisdiction of the agent in the plan.
The only thing is that you want to make sure that you're not trying to do it as like some sort of one-off argument. It's like, well, they didn't specify the agent, so they lose. You know, he's like, come on now, come on, like you got to make an argument out of it, make it a strategy.
We even had a discussion earlier, a few weeks or months ago, when the policy resolution came out. I believe the policy resolution says regulation.
Statutory regulations.
Okay. Statutory regulation.
Statutory regulation.
That's really important. Okay, statutory regulation. Regulation by itself may not mean it may not be a term of art in the law world as far as legislative and executive power. But when it says statutory resolution, regulation. That means only one agent can pass the statute, and that's the Congress, right? So you need to be aware on the AF of who can pass your plans to not expose yourself to improvisational style attacks from the neg, because they're just trained to ask these specific questions.
And that's a good question for the neg to have built in. So there's a really common thing that we teach, affirmative debaters, is if you're just in a rush and you don't want to go through the details of it, like, it's normal means for everything. Normal means is the common term when they're passing a plan and they don't want to say this is the party that will pass it. Congress will pass, the president will sign. It will be the Department of the Interior is going to fund it, and it's going to be this many millions of dollars, and the timeline is 3 months because that's how long it takes. Like, when you don't specify those things, teams just say normal means. It is always in the best interest of the negative team to ask that. Like, by the way, what do you mean by normal means? Now, I do see a lot of negative teams that will just run with it, like they only said normal means and therefore they're wrong. Like, that's not totally fair, because it doesn't give the affirmative team the opportunity. But that should be immediately a point of information if there's going to be some contention there. Like, if it's a very straightforward policy and there's no potential there, then you don't have to. But I still always recommend to.
If the resolution, for instance, said Congress passes a rule to do this, and you said by normal means, it makes kind of a lot more sense than when you have a plan that funding or
solve some problem go
and then when it's
that's
gray,
when you really got to be specific on that, because even so to spec it down further, even within that there are different, there's agent of action and agent of enforcement, and sometimes those actually need to be different things. Like, one body can make it happen, but the enforcement needs to be a different body. I saw a deep out round at a big tournament one time that came down to whether the Department of Justice or whether JAG courts were the ones that got to rule on something. So it all came down to
who had jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly on enforcement though. Not even on who got to pass the thing, but who got to do the enforcement, and because it actually mattered in the context of the round.
Tim, you brought up, we originally were talking about agents, and now we're talking about a second plan specification called enforcement. And I just want you to explain, what does enforcement mean? I believe, Jared, E is this in spec is enforcement, correct?
Yeah.
So what does enforcement mean to you, Tim?
So that's the body that has to make sure that the plan happens. So there's a kind of topicality that's affects topicality, where a plan, does something and then assumes that the results of that plan, that plan inaction will eventually produce the results that create, the circumstances that make it topical. And so oftentimes that's really just because their enforcement has been very poorly laid out. Like sometimes it's just the plan itself that didn't lay it out right. But if you don't have the right enforcement to make sure that the plan happens, right? So in the case of like the USFG, it's usually like the executive branch. Like they're the ones that make sure that the laws are followed. So like the legislative body can make something a law, but they don't enforce it. Yeah. It's the executive branch that follows up to make it.
Enforcement specification is one of my favorite spec arguments, and it's not just who enforces it, but how they do it, right? And so my favorite example of this was like a final round. The topic was that California should ban smoking, and we're like, wow, yeah. I mean, that's a pretty tough. That's a pretty tough resolution, but man, this affirmative team, they were in like final round. You know what I mean? It's like they killed it. They did great. You know what I mean? The negative team like presses how they're going to enforce it, specifically asking like, what is the penalty for violating this rule? And the affirmative did not have. All I remember is that they didn't have very clear answers. They didn't have very good. Like I think they were going with the normal means thing.
Their demeanor applied.
Yeah, and so it kind of sets up this fork. Where if the enforcement is too lax, then you get no solvency. If the enforcement is too strict, then that is injustice, right? And so like and I'm like that, that's fair. You know what I mean? That you have to find this sweet spot on in order to kind of like thread that needle for solvency. And so in eSpec really opens that up. You know what I mean? And like that one question they asked, from a point of information, just opened up this entire strategy of solvency versus justice and stuff like that. I'm like, I thought they did really good.
Yeah, I saw a really fascinating one when it was obviously dating myself, but it was like legalizing recreational marijuana. And that was a really common question that like needed to be loaded up, because it was like, is this going to be enforced like we currently enforce alcohol? Is it going to be enforced like tobacco, like, based on ages and who can buy it and when, like, but that kind of stuff has to be detailed out when you're talking about like access to a large, group now. And a lot of rounds really did end up coming down to like, oh, well, you said that it's only, going to be enforced like cigarettes, which you are allowed to use in your vehicle, which means that now like people will be driving high, and that has all these other problems. So, like a ton of disadvantages come out of that lack of enforcement specificity. So I think like there's good reason to really flush out and not just default to normal means when having those kind of cases.
Just to kind of, I want to put two more cents on this. I mean, just because, Jared, you said a really good point where, how you enforce, meaning, is it going to be a $10 fine or a $10,000 fine?
Those are great questions.
Yeah. And then just also remember the aspect of, even if it was, let's say $10,000, let's say they only allocate 50 agents to cover the entire United States to enforce this law. I mean, that's a very kind of, over exaggerated example, but another aspect of enforcement challenging it, and Jared, you can finish this point, is just you are unable to carry out these things as you are saying. They will not have any effect despite the fact that you're charging people $10,000 getting caught smoking cigarettes or something like that.
Yeah, but that goes back to what Tim was talking about which agent, enforces it. So there's an agent that enacts it, and then
but the means of that agent of enforcement. I mean, not to get too deep, but I mean,
like if you're saying, okay, so the FDA is going to do this, it's like, man, they are already saddled.
How are you going to enforce this law? Oh, we're going to invent technology that can see through people's homes that doesn't exist right now. Like you're going to be like, okay, well you can't. That's a whole separate plan. That's a whole separate issue. That's a whole separate thing, and that means it's impossible as a status quo. So just
you get into
there are ways to challenge enforcement. And it's really important because one theme through all these spec arguments is, especially on the neg, it's important to note this is kind of an improvisational thing you can use. Spec arguments, you may not you're charged with the knowledge of knowing you're going to challenge them, but you don't know which one they may not be flushing out. You may not know that they're going to leave all of them out. You may have to be improvisational with how you deal with all of the spec arguments they bring. But when you have to rely on yourself to some extent on the neg, going, I know that I'm going to go in there and I'm going to have some arguments come into my mind, a lot of times they may be centered around these spec arguments.
Yeah, because like if somebody busts out a legalized weed case, you're like, oh,
a great case. Call it like a great plan text.
Yeah, and you're like, man, what arguments? I'm not going to go like war on drugs good. Like, there's just not enough there. You know what I mean? And so, like, a spec argument really opens up some avenues that you might not have. So, e-spec on a marijuana case is like, I think, a pretty darn good way to go.
There are safe harbors of little arguments that you can kind of trust that you could probably make. And even if it's like, we haven't talked about this, maybe we can move on to funding. Funding is a huge spec argument. Spec, the beginning of what's that, Jared? Which one is it?
I just call it funding spec, but then on my flow I write a little $sign with spec.
Okay.
So these are my flow. This is how I flow these things.
Funding is a thing where you can almost always challenge it one way or the other. I mean, it's either too much money being invested in a problem that doesn't require that much money, or not enough money to fix the problems that they're trying to fix. And we talk about this throughout from the very beginning, at least I have, about funding sticks out to me more than all, because when you have loose abilities for enforcement, but the funding is very high, then you just argue how this is not worth it. And then to the other side, like if they're not paying enough money in the federal government, oftentimes nothing will get done. So
let's see. I think I might even go the other way with it, where I would ask questions about enforcement to try to like pin them down, but I would just let them go with the normal means. I'm like, oh, normal means? All right, well, let me tell you what normal means is when it comes to funding in the federal government. Let's talk about
what does normal means mean to you, Jared? Just to be real clear, before we talk about this too specifically.
Yeah, because you pass these laws, but then you pass a budget. You know what I mean? It's like, and during the budgeting phase that those things get decided. And so adding whatever expense you're doing, usually these are big ticket items that you're debating about, right? Yeah. Adding that means that something else is going to be cut. And now you can almost kind of have a politics DA hybrid with this, right? Where it's kind of like, what is on their political radar? It's like, I don't know, Planned Parenthood. I don't know, it's like, these,
in order to pass a bill that's on the other side that we want to negotiate.
Yeah, and you can just make the argument like, okay, the Democrats are in control, so Democrats are like, what are they going to cut? And you could build a disadvantage off of that. You know what I mean? It's like they're they're into defunding the police. Maybe you got some stuff on why that, like on a federal level is particularly bad.
Usually I see oftentimes like, going to war is offset by cutting healthcare, like giving free healthcare is offset by like cutting the military, and so there's like those. I mean, just being two of the biggest line items in the
Like
those two.
Social Security is like
another
all the time. You know what I mean? It's like, and so I would let people say funding by normal means, because then it gives me the freedom to say, all right, this is the first thing on the chopping block, and now I just run a DA off of it. They're like, that's not going to be it. It's kind of like, you said normal means, okay? All right, I'm telling you, like, this is a pretty predictable thing that's going to get cut.
Yeah.
All right, we can't fund everything.
If you can nail them down, or if you do have plans that you're working with that like are tied to, let's say we're trying to pass some bill, Save the Whales, and we're going to take our money from the education system and we're going to put it in this new program that is going to be used for education, but it's also going to be used to save the whales. Let's just say like educating the whales. No. But my point is like, let's say, I mean, it sounds good. Like kids are, people are going to be learning about whales. The whales are going to get saved. Education will change and we're moving toward the future. Well, there's an argument on the flip side of that says like, any pulling of any funding from the education system at this time is bad, because some kids somewhere in the most disproportionately affected area will be affected worse than all of them, and that's going to be perpetuated by your Saving the Whales campaign. Your whales matter more than people, or like my that sort of logic is all in my mind tied to a funding argument.
But think about like the wall, all right, the border wall. That funding,
what border wall?
Yeah, the funding become an issue, right? Where like,
no, it's definitely an issue.
Yeah, Mexico never paid for it, hasn't paid for it, and so where's the funding coming from? Well, military. Trump gets, is trying to divert it away from like residential housing and military and things like that. It's like that's a perfect sort of disadvantage. It's a real life sort of funding disadvantage if you're just going to talk about normal means. But the thing, notice how like certain amount of money gets allocated to the military, and then once it gets allocated to that, then people start fudging with it. You know what I mean? They start like, I'll say, well, I'll take it from inside there. And so like if you're going to do like an environmental one, then you kind of do another like environmental disadvantage. It's like once it gets to the Department of the Interior has to budget certain things, and this thing is going to be cut. They're going to tap into the North Atlantic wildlife. You know what I mean? And so that was one of the disadvantages we always did.
There's also freedom if you're not actually running like an actual bill plan that already has spelled out exactly how it's getting its funding, and you're creating a plan. You can kind of be tricky with your agents or funding arguments. I mean, we just talked about pulling money from education to save the whales. What if we pulled that money from the military and saved the whales? And would that affect the judges, or would you think that has a better chance of passing? Could you make better arguments based on that?
Yeah, we did that all the time. We would like say, we'll just we'll just cancel this branch of the military in order to pay for it. And we did that almost like a joke, we're not running advantages off of it, but stay off the funding arguments, okay?
It may deflect some obvious arguments compared to saying let's pull from education. So and you could even take bills that do exist and say it's this bill minus the funding and put it here. Like you can play with everything that you see on the internet or whatever you can come up with. Tim, go ahead.
I think it's the easiest when affirmative teams just have like in their back pocket some ludicrously expensive thing that like is especially like the bigger the PR about how bad
bullet train funding,
So like for the longest time it was like Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program stayed in function for like way longer than his presidency, even though it like never was a thing. So like, okay, here's several $billion we just tap into. Or a lot of people nowadays like to say like, oh, cut the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter programs. It's like X trillion dollars or whatever. And there's not a ton of people that are going to like really rally around that necessarily. So it's useful to have some of those in your back pocket as an affirmative team. But I think like you make the good point that as a negative team, like you can definitely pick more things around that. Personally, I think that's like kind of low-hanging fruit. It's like in debate, you have to make decisions because there's lots of things you can argue about, but you have a finite amount of time to argue, so you can't make every argument. And I usually tell my debaters like avoid the funding argument because unless like you've got some good reason why, I feel like it gets just unfortunately messy, like low impact. Like it's harder to say like this is good and this is bad, and like some of those comparisons. Some rounds it totally does, but I think funding debates as a judge, I find them boring to watch.
No, it's hard to actually do a legit funding DA. You know what I mean? It probably because people think they get it, and it's harder than they think. You know what I mean? Like what I was talking about is that you have to get past the first stage of allocation, right? It's kind of like okay, this amount of money, where it's like you have to go within the category. So like military to military, environment to environment, education to education, health to health, usually was a better way to do the disadvantage like once it gets down to that level, it starts becoming a lot more political. You know what I mean? It's like the picture stuff is handled in Congress, but when it gets down to that level, you could just say, well, we can't do that because we don't have enough money. You know what I mean? And then make a politics out of it.
One answer, by the way, just because we're kind of talking about both sides of every debate. If someone in debate, a lot of times, at least especially as a judge, I try not to argue this ever, but there's this thing that you can say in debate where it says, even if I'm not paying enough money, even if this isn't going to fund enough to get me 100% of my solvency, if I can get 1% of solvency, this is a good idea. So you should pass this plan. And that is one way to respond to funding arguments, by the way, just to kind of like give some back and forth. And so just to recap, I mean, we're going to keep talking. We have another, I want to talk about time frame before this is all over. But, just know that on the affirmative, knowing to fill out your agent, enforcement, funding, and time frame specs for your plan, being very cognizant of these things because you're likely going to be attacked on them whether or not you bring them up. So you better bring some up and have something to stand on. And understand that there is a place for saying things like normal means. But if your plan is open to attack on specs, you should know that, and hopefully you can kind of see where that is grayer than other areas. So
I said normal means on purpose just to make people like get stuck in that argument.
Yeah.
Normal means, oh my.
Well, we hear it a lot, right? I mean,
I'm like, all right, let's see who knows more about this.
Yeah.
You want to go down that route, I guess. All right.
Tim, let's start with you. Tim, what does time frame mean as a spec argument?
So it's when something is executed. And this one, I think, is another one.
Ends, right? Or whether when it
or,
starts and ends.
Or.
Right. Like if it is a program that needs to have a deadline, or if it's like we need to pass this particular bill. Like passing a bill doesn't typically have like an end date to it, but some things are like, oh, if we need to change this or add like this, new intervention or something. But I usually see as one of the easiest when you are on the wrong side of a resolution, because there are definitely lopsided resolutions. When you're on the wrong side of a resolution, a time frame like readjustment. So I like running a spec on whatever they're saying, because normally people like normal means usually people say like right now or whatever. But there's so many arguments that people can make, just little picks of no, we're going to do it after the election. No, we're going to do it in 3 years. No, we're going, or if it is, normal means it's going to be in the next cycle of Congress. Like, no, we're going to pass it right now. So you can play around with timeframes so that you're still doing the exact same plan and have all those benefits. But there is something to be said for like when that is executed makes a big difference. And then you can talk about the chronology of what if it were to pass right now versus in a year or after the election or whatever. You can make those kinds of changes, and that sometimes is worthwhile. I think similar to funding, like it is maybe gone after a little bit too readily, but it can still be done very effectively.
I got a perfect example. So this year's NFALD topic is the immigration topic, right? The statutory restrictions. And so a brilliant early case was put out by Kansas City, Kansas about removing health-related grounds from the Customs and Border Patrol sort of reasons that you can get turned away at the ports. So apparently there's like a lot of international students. They'll get accepted into college. They'll be coming through customs and they'll just get turned away. And they're like, what the hell? I'm going to college. And they'll just say, it's your responsibility to prove that you meet all these qualifications, which is like health-related grounds, criminality, blah, 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 like 8 different things. But health-related grounds, so this Kansas City, Kansas debater basically said, let's just strike that because that's outdated. Like immigration policies are really poor way to like prevent disease from crossing over, especially considering how many tourists we have. Like, come on, you know what I mean? Like that's like you're not going to like they're not, and so it kind of becomes like this critique about the sort of long outdated assumption that foreigners are fucking diseased or something like that, right? Anyways, that's the affirmative. Great affirmative, right? I'm struggling to come up with negatives. But one idea, I'm thinking maybe a time delay counterplan, right? Until after the pandemic, because right now people will freak out if all of a sudden you're saying, all right, we're just going to remove the health-related grounds. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't really produce any different effects. Nobody's really in more danger or anything like that after plan. But the perception is enough. I'm like, you know what? Maybe that's not the best timing, And so you just time delay after the pandemic, and so it could go a lot quieter. And that was my strategy. I know there's problems with it. I know there are, but
no, I was going to say, even while you were talking in the beginning, it's like this was obviously something you heard before. I mean, these arguments make a lot of sense outside of Corona land. Like it's really hard to say, like, I don't want to talk to like my neighbor right now. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, it's a little bit like just, I'm worried about my health. And so normally, I mean, we do worry about our health, and there are, germaphobes who typically, have always been a certain way, but like, we're all very hypersensitive. And so maybe you got to be very careful when you're running a plan.
Right. But that's more of a perception thing when it comes to the health-related grounds.
Well, stigma and perception are built right into that type of thing, right?
I think there's a lot of good grounds. I mean, especially very much right this moment when people will say time delay until after the election. Hell, even like the candidates are even doing that. Like,
that's happening with the Supreme Court
after the election. Like
the Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, it totally happened.
Between previous inauguration and this inauguration of when is a better time to do it. So like there are definitely arguments that are good to make of this would best be done when it's not super contentious, or like it's, if it's about to be a lame duck Congress with so many, seats flipping, they're going to do everything they can to like throw up red tape or bog it down or gut it.
It's a creative way to make unrealistic plans a little more realistic. Like, I mean,
right. Yeah. Like,
you
have to actually face like, really, like the federal government is really going to fund this? Like, no,
we're going to pass the Green New Deal today. Like, maybe you'll have a better chance. Hopefully, if you do have a better chance, it might be after the election. Like, so because there's just so many side of a barn attacks to saying that right now. I mean, and if you don't know, then you need to do some research and find out what we're saying.
Okay, I'm going to surprise you guys with one spec argument that I only heard very briefly once, and I can't do any justice for it.
I hope I heard it.
And it's a little over time, but this isn't going to take long. But it's called O-spec.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, I know. The way that somebody told it to me was over specification. And I guess this is like a fairness argument, but this is somebody that like I respect as a coach telling me this, right?
On the AF or neg?
It would be neg. Neg would be. It's an argument more than just a concept, right? It's kind of like they over specified the plan.
Critique.
And so it's like the over specification disallows debate on
the merits.
Against their policy. So I never saw this ever put into action. I've never seen like an actual shell in in an evidence packet or anything like that. But I heard this, and so
I feel like every single time some kid tries to argue why normal means is fine, is basically saying over spec argument. They're like, look, you're asking me to go on my computer and get information for this round. How am I supposed to know what you're gonna run? Like I mean, to some extent. It's such a good point, Jared, because you need to understand that you aren't supposed to know every little thing, and you should be able to argue the merits if that's all you know how to argue, because you didn't know the nitty gritty of some crazy thing that you didn't know. You know what I mean? That by the way, that goes down. Let's say you're in a policy debate. The first day you have that excuse. The last day at AFA or, not AFA, but at CETA, like you don't have quite as much unless they change their whole plan back down to some other finite thing that you had no idea about. And then overspec really starts to come in. But part of that would be like, look, we've gone against them 10 times. They never brought up this argument. And now it's for the first time they just did this. And so we don't know. And so, look, we don't want to talk about the merits because we don't know.
I honestly, I don't think that I would be likely as a judge to pick that up because, like, okay, great, the affirmative team did a crap ton of research and they detailed
what if they spent
like, unless it's like a multi actor, if it's like a fiat abuse or something like that, we're like, oh, we're doing this plan and here's like 9 different parties that are all involved and here's like 10 different funding to, like, if they're doing that and it's now outside the scope of what normal means actually would be, or that's beyond their one fiat, their one actor getting to do something.
I think it comes down to like when they specify which representatives vote which way.
And to say that you didn't, so you should lose. Like okay, well, you know what?
56 to 34 votes.
And Tim, to your point, like this is all style now. Like you're like, well, you know what? I don't think I've ever heard someone who gave me much of specifications that I didn't buy to have someone say otherwise. I also know though that how many times have you said yes to normal means? I mean
when it's like normal means is a couple hundred pages of legislation and like months and thousands of hands on the single bill, like because it's partly and like
there's an essence of like passing something through Congress that if we can't just like fiat the idea that Congress is going to do our plan, then we literally should all just be quiet and go play basketball because there's like no reason to be in here. Like we need some ability to play around, but the higher you get up, the more advanced you get, spec arguments are most definitely, they should be flushed out every single time in a policy style round.
Yeah. All right. We're over time. So it turned out to be a fairly good discussion. Okay, everyone. Hey, we got ourselves Tim Seavey, Matt Shapiro. I'm Jared Kabik Miller. We'll see you next week, everybody. Okay.
Thanks.